Exodus 21 verse 7 and 20 to 21. So, verse 7. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. And then verse 20. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. And then reading from Leviticus, chapter 11, verses 9 to 12. Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean. And since you are to regard them as unclean, you must not eat their meat. You must regard their carcasses as unclean. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean by you. And then Leviticus 19, verses 27 and 28. Do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. And then lastly, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. All scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, team, for leading us this morning. And this is probably a good opportunity, my one chance to remind you of that do not clip the hair at the sides of your head thing for that current hairstyle. It's pretty trendy these days. But maybe you'll get away with it after you've heard my message. In case you don't know me, my name's Paul Vandersee. I'm married to Sarah. We've got 3 kids. Brianna's sitting there in the 3rd row. Miriam's downstairs at kids' church, and although she's 20, so she's not at kids' church in that sense. And Max is off doing QUT exploration with Sarah today. So that's our family. And today we're continuing in our series of Christian questions. And I don't think this is actually a question that I've ever been asked. But the question that I am asking is, how should I read the Bible so that I don't become an atheist? So I'm going to see if this works. How should I read the Bible so that I don't become an atheist? And a little bit of background to this unusual question might be helpful. So, Christians, we are exhorted and encouraged to read our Bibles, are we not? It is, of course, the primary way that God has chosen to reveal himself explicitly to all people through all generations, through all of history since the Bible has been recorded. And we know that God can reveal himself in other ways. Dreams and visions is just one example. But most of us, let's face it, don't get those. And for those that do, then eventually they have to go back to the Bible anyway. So why do I say the Bible is the primary way God reveals himself? Well, there are two thought processes in Christian thinking. One is that God reveals himself through general revelation, the other through special revelation. You may or may not have heard those terms before. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul discusses how people have no excuse for not recognizing that there's a God. And he explains in chapter 1, verses 19 to 20, why this is. Since what may be known about God is plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. In other words, as we look around at creation, we are meant to generally attribute its existence to an eternal and divine God. But we can't know everything there is to know about this God through general revelation by looking out at creation. To know details such as, well, who is this God? Why did he create us, and how can we enjoy or know him? We need more specific information. And in Christian thinking, this is called special revelation. Special revelation is the main reason God has chosen to produce a Bible for us. And because in it, God expands on what we see in general revelation. He provides explicit details about who he is and why he has done what he's done and how we are meant to relate to him. Without the special revelation of the Bible, we can't truly know God. We can't truly understand his holiness and our unholiness, nor can we know what he has done through Jesus for our sake, to bring us back to himself. And of course, the most specific revelation of God is when God himself, in the form of Jesus, enters our world and speaks God's words and acts as God to show us who God truly is. We were reminded of this last week, that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And the historical details of Jesus in our world are recorded in the special revelation that we call the Bible. So if general revelation reveals that there's a God, and special revelation tells us who he is and what he's like, does the following quote surprise you? Okay, in case you can't read, reading the Bible is the fast track to atheism. So, just to get our terms right, a theist is someone who believes in God, and atheist is someone who says there is no God. Okay, so an atheist. I found this quote in a book I read recently, and according to Penn Jillette, if you read the Bible, you will find yourself propelled down the path of not believing in God, which seems to contradict the whole point of special revelation. You can find the following post or meme online as well by a guy called Andrew Seidel. He's a lawyer in the United States, and he's particularly opposed to Christian nationalism, which is something we don't really have any idea about, but is big in the US. In case you're not able to read that, the road to atheism is littered with Bibles that have been read cover to cover. So he's taking things to the next level. He's espousing that if you were to read the whole Bible, not just the parts that people like me speak about on Sunday or the parts that are easy for you to read or that you agree with, but all of it, cover to cover, you will wind up not believing in God. An atheist. So the book that I've been reading recently talks about this Christian university student. He grew up in a Christian home. He went to church regularly. He was a part of the music team. He grew up through a youth group. He was very active in his faith, and he ultimately became an atheist. Nothing bad had happened to him at church. He had no reason to quit on his faith. He valued the leaders. He liked the music. He enjoyed the preaching. He authentically loved church, and he loved his faith. But he left it because he finally got around to reading his Bible. Could he be you? I know Christians who sound like the young man in this book. They've grown up going to church, Christian families, involved in ministry, currently professing Christians, but they've never read the whole Bible. And I know how easy it is to fall into this category because I was one of them. Maybe you're one of those people who's always been a Christian but never fully read the Bible, and now you're wondering if you should, because it might mess up your faith. Or maybe you've read the whole Bible, and though you read the weird and hard to understand bits, you kind of just left them there, and now you're wondering what might happen if you actually looked at them. And we had some of them read to us earlier this morning. Maybe you're an atheist and you're thinking, maybe I should read the Bible so it confirms what you believe. So wherever you sit, if you read the Bible, there are going to be parts that are difficult and hard to understand, and just plain weird. And we need some skills to tackle it. So what was it about reading the whole Bible that made this unnamed uni student, and I just plucked a name out of the air, let's call him Rob. Any Robs here today? What made Rob leave behind the Christian faith that he'd always known and turn to atheism? Well, according to his story, he knew many of the popular parts of the Bible. He knew stories like David and Goliath and Daniel and the lion's den. He loved Jesus' teaching in areas such as the Sermon on the Mount and so on. But when Rob got to uni, he started reading more of the Bible, including parts that he never heard preached on a Sunday or in youth group. And the more that Rob read, the more questions this intelligent, deep-thinking young man had. For him, it was when he joined an on-campus Bible study that was looking at an Old Testament book, Exodus. We had some verses from Exodus read to us this morning. And it was at that point that his faith was really shaken to its core. I want to list some of his objections and see if you find them objectionable too. So, a bit of historical context. God's people had been slaves in Egypt, and God has raised up Moses to lead them out of their captivity. And in the process, God brings on 10 plagues on Egypt and the people. And the last plague is the death of the firstborn of all of Egypt's families. And in Exodus 12, it says, "And that night at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn son of the prisoner in the dungeon. Even the firstborn of their livestock were killed. And loud wailing was heard throughout the land of Egypt." So, a natural and understandable question is, how could a loving God cause the death of so many innocents? Rob raises the irony of how Christians like us recoil in horror at the way that King Herod in the New Testament ordered the death of all of the firstborn sons under the age of 2 in and around Bethlehem in order to try and kill Jesus before this supposed king grew up. And Rob wonders why it's evil for, I've just made everything disappear all of a sudden, for God to, let me get it right. Why is it evil for God to do it? No, not God, Herod to do it. Herod to do it, but not God. And this is a really good question. Another strange thing that Rob raises in Exodus 21, which we heard read, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a result, but they're not to be punished if the slave recovers in a day or two, since the slave is their property. So God seems to be supporting slavery and allowing the beating of slaves and sees slaves as property. And earlier we had it read as well that if you're a dad, you can sell your daughter if you need to. What kind of God is this, Rob is asking? Another bizarre command raised by Rob includes the one about magic undies. You don't know the one about magic undies? Let me tell you, it's in Exodus 28, where after giving detailed instructions about what priests are to wear, God explains very specifically about the underwear design, so that they will not incur guilt and die. Do you have such undies? Sounds like magic undies, doesn't it? And just a little bit strange to us. I was looking on social media to see what kind of talk was on this topic, and you don't have to go far. One guy commented that he read the Bible twice and was convinced, utterly convinced, that it was not true as a result of reading it through twice. And there were plenty of others who pointed out all the apparent issues like the ones mentioned, plus many more. And it's not hard to find places where the Bible is mocked mercilessly, and those who believe it are considered deluded fools. I'm looking at some of you and me. So, both Christians and non-Christians find parts of the Bible that are troubling. How is a person who believes in salvation through the Jesus who is revealed in the Bible, i.e. through special revelation, how are they to continue to put their trust in this Jesus if the rest of the book that records him is untrustworthy, confusing, incorrect, horrid, add whatever word you need to? Well, there's good news, because people read the Bible and become Christians. Some people, when they read it, are convinced there's no God. Others are convinced there is. The difference, and I keep touching the screen and making it all disappear, the difference could be learning how to read it. And so today, that's my goal, to try and provide you and me with some skills to read it properly. There are reasonable explanations for much of what is difficult to read in the Bible. I'm not going to be able to give you explanations for all of them, or probably any of them this morning. I'll refer you to the book later for that. But I want to give you a few simple skills so that next time you come across one of these difficult verses, you'll be better equipped perhaps to understand what God might have been saying in it. So what's the key? The key is knowing how not to read the Bible. And that, in fact, is the title of the book by Dan Kimball that came out in 2020, How Not to Read the Bible, and I highly recommend it. There are 4 points that Dan says we must remember to put into practice. Oops, have I gone too far? No, that's all good. Here they are. And we're going to learn these today in a very interesting way. So you'll see them all popping up here one by one, and I'll go through them all very briefly. So what we're going to do to help you remember, I'm going to teach you each line, and we're going to make a song out of it. And it's a very easily remembered tune. If you've ever sung Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you'll be able to do this with me. So as we go through, we'll add a line, and then by the end of it, we'll be able to sing the whole song together. And I know my family is cringing, except Brianna, who wasn't here this week, but the rest of the family who aren't here, they're probably cringing at the thought of me doing this, because I've been singing it all week at home. So, number one, the Bible is a library, not a book. And it goes like this. I'll sing it for you. The Bible is a library, not a book. Your turn. The Bible is a library, not a book. Excellent. I can hear that loud and clear. So, every time you open a Bible, it is helpful to think library. Why? Because the Bible is filled with books, like a library. Opening a certain book of the Bible is like pulling a book off the shelf in the library. And here's just an example of some ways that the Bible is depicted as a list of books on shelves. If you've always looked at the Bible as a book, and Dan held one up before, it's time to start thinking of it as a library. In fact, it's a library which is a collection of 66 books, all contained in one volume. Now, I don't know if anyone here owns The Lord of the Rings at home. Have you got that? Yes? So in my book, it's one thick book. But how many books are in that book? 3. Absolutely. So that's exactly the case with our Bible, except it's 66 of them. The 66 books in that library were written by approximately 40 different men over the course of around 1,500 years, and they all came from very diverse backgrounds. Anyone know, let's pick, Isaiah. What was his background? Prophet. Excellent. Ezra? Priest? Matthew? Tax collector? John? Fisherman? Moses? Shepherd? Yeah. And what about Luke? Doctor? Yeah. Very good. So like a library, the Bible contains books that are in various different genres or types of writing. There are books of law, you can see some up there, of wisdom, poetry, apocalyptic writing, Stay tuned next week for that, I think. Letters, gospels, prophecy. Knowing the genre or the type of writing is really important to helping you understand it. For example, the book Song of Songs, mostly as a book of poetry. And in the book, Solomon describes his wife in poetic language. And if you were to take his words literally, which is always dangerous when reading poetry, you might find that you don't quite agree with how ravishing he finds her. Have a little look. You might have to look closely at this. So you can see that her hair is like a flock of goats. Her teeth are like freshly shorn sheep. Her neck is like the Tower of Babel. And I think honey drips from her lips, and among other things. So you can read all of that in chapter 4 and 7. So literal reading of some books can lead you down the wrong path. You've got to be careful of that. So how do you know what genre you're reading? Well, for me, I'm no scholar, so most people like me go and jump into the introduction that's in the Bible, and in there somewhere it will usually tell us. And you could do a quick online search if you wanted to as well, if you're not sure. And another really helpful hint is, of course, to remember the Bible's written in 2 sections. We all probably know that. The Old Testament or the Old Covenant and the New Testament or the New Covenant. The Old Testament covers an agreement God made with ancient Israel on how they're outlining how they were to know him or to relate to him and worship him. That was to that group of people. The New Testament is the agreement God has made with people since Jesus. And it's relating particularly to us in that case, isn't it? But as well as many others. We've got to keep that in mind when reading these difficult passages. Who was it intended for? Was it for ancient Israel, or is it more for us? And of course, it's a really old book. Just like libraries contain really old books, you wouldn't want to pick it up and read it just like you would a modern magazine. You've got to keep these things in mind. But even though it's old and written by many people, ultimately, we were reminded from the reading earlier this morning in 2 Timothy 3:16 that the whole Bible was breathed out by God. That's an unusual word for us to think about, breathed out. But God, again another unusual word, superintended or oversaw the human authors as they wrote it. So while using their own writing styles and their own personalities, they still recorded in that original language exactly the words that God wanted recorded. Perfectly guided by God, entirely inspired by him. So whenever you open a book of the Bible, remember it is an ancient library, and the author was writing in a specific time period to a specific culture, possibly using a specific genre as well. So that's number 1. The Bible is a library, not a book. Number 2, the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So I'll sing the 2 lines, and then you can sing them back. The Bible is a library, not a book. The Bible was written for us, but not to us. All right, ready? The Bible is a library, not a book. The Bible was written for us, but not to us. Yeah, you get the hang of this. Don't read the Bible with the immediate thought of, what does this mean for me and my life? Dr. John Walton writes, "We believe the Bible was written for us, that it's for everyone of all times and places because it's God's word. But it wasn't written to us. It wasn't written in our language. It wasn't written with our culture in mind or our culture in view." So to get the most from the Bible, we need to enter the world of the original audience and see how they would have heard and understood it. When we read it like it's primarily a message to me, we end up picking and choosing what we like or don't like. One of the verses that's often quoted during hard times is this one. Don't know if you can see it. It's Jeremiah 29:11, and it's even literally on coffee cups as well. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. I mean, who doesn't love to think that that is God's plan for their life? The only problem is it's not. Who was the original audience? And what did it mean to them? Okay. Well, the people of ancient Israel, I heard some people say that, had been unfaithful to God. And true to God's warnings, God allowed the powerful nation of Babylon to come in, destroy Jerusalem, and carry off most of the people into captivity in Babylon. Jeremiah, who wrote those verses, was a prophet of Israel, and he happened to be a captive in Babylon at the time when God told him to tell the people these words. The only problem was that 4 chapters earlier, God has also told Jeremiah other information about their situation, and it would not be over quickly. It would take 70 years before the promise of prosperity, hope, and a future would happen. What do we take from this? Well, the promise was not to us. Not all verses are written to us, though they are for us, since we can benefit from knowing how and why God worked in that way at that time. Remember, the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So number 3, I think you'll get the... Oh, it's frozen. Hang on. I've got no action. It's still on. I've got my pointer. We're back again. Okay, we'll see if it jumps 10 pages now. All right, so we know line 1 and line 2. Line 3, well, you can sing this with me. You know the tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Let's all sing it together. I think you'll get it. The Bible is a library, not a book. The Bible was written for us, but not to us. Never read a Bible verse. Stop. I know some of you can remember the last line, but not yet. So, you're doing really well, actually. On his website, this fellow called Greg Kukul, it's called Stand to Reason, his website, he writes this: if there was one bit of wisdom, one rule of thumb, one single skill I could impart, one useful tip that would serve you well for the rest of your life, what would it be? What is the single most important practical skill I've ever learned as a Christian? Here it is. Never read a Bible verse. I'll finish the quote. And there it is. Instead, always read a paragraph at least. So if you were thinking I was giving you permission to not read the Bible, think again. If our student friend Rob had known this, maybe he would have found some of those more difficult verses a little easier to make sense of. The only reason you would ever quote a single Bible verse is where the entire audience understands clearly the context of that verse. Most critics of the Bible love to take a verse, rip it out of context, and quote it as an example of why the Bible is ridiculous or outdated or wrong or horrid. And that is a great way to misunderstand the Bible and apply it incorrectly. Never read a Bible verse is a reminder that every verse has a context. It was written in a specific time to a specific person or people with a specific purpose. There's always a larger story. So, never read a Bible verse means never read a Bible verse in isolation. That's not how to read the Bible. Instead, if someone shows you a Bible verse and is criticizing it, go ahead and look at that single Bible verse with them. Then read the paragraph it is in. Then look at and read the chapter the paragraph and verse are in. And, time permitting, look at the whole book the chapter and paragraph and verse are in. And at least, if you can't do that, look at a summary of it or look at the introduction. And then check where that book fits into the larger story of the Bible. Does anyone know or recall the way that Star Wars movies begin? How do they start? Yeah, you can even quote it for me. I wasn't looking that specific, but something like this. They always have this scrolling backstory that sets the scene for what's about to happen. George Lucas knew how important it was that we had a broader context to understand what was about to happen next. And the same is with the Bible. For much of my life, though I'd read parts of the Bible, it never clicked for me that there was this big epic story that God was telling in it. And that each book fitted into that story at some particular point. It was quite the revelation to realize this. And then I had to learn the story. And it's been one of the most helpful things I've ever done. And actually, it can be fun doing it. Some of you were at Melt Camp this year. You will remember, and I bet you if I asked some of you, in around 20 seconds, you could get up here and tell me the whole Bible story. We had our speaker, Mike, teach us the Bible story. He did it in a 10-minute aerobics video that we watched. And at the conclusion, it has this summary of the whole of the 10 minutes leading prior to that, which tells you the whole story. Anyone want to do it? Faith, you keen to jump up and do it? No, she's not keen. I reckon if you asked Max next week, my son Max, he would be able to do it for you, and it's really very good. The Bible Project, some of you will have heard of the Bible Project. They have a great 5-minute video that gives you the big picture of the Bible with pictures and all that kind of stuff as well to help stimulate your mind. There's lots of ways you can get this epic story of the Bible into your head. And you can download them all for free. Here's one of them. This is the one that Mike, it's pretty small, but it gives it, you can see the idea. Mike showed us this one at camp, and right up the top, you can sort of see there's this kind of line. There's a big cross in the center. At the very top, you can't really see the words, but this is the bit that the guys will summarize for you in 20 seconds. It's the whole story. I'm going to add all of these images and stuff. I'll give them to John so he can stick them in the newsletter. So if you want to download something this week, you can have a look. Of course, there's nothing like doing this stuff with other people. So a few years ago, the young adults group that Sarah and I were involved with, we did this whole Bible storyline as a Bible study, and it was excellent. So I encourage you to do that if you haven't done that in your group. So once you get this big picture, you'll have a much clearer understanding of where Jesus fits and why he's important. So never read a Bible verse. And to show you the importance of context, if you were to watch the recording of today's message and listen to me saying only that line, you could easily say that this church espouses not reading the Bible. And that would perfectly misrepresent everything I've said this morning. So the fourth and final point to remember is all of the Bible points to Jesus. And like all of these attempts to fit songs into well-known jingles, it doesn't quite fit, but I think you'll get it. Just the tricky part is the Jesus. It's kind of like Jesus, okay? So, ready? Here we go, all together. The Bible is a library, not a book. The Bible was written for us, but not to us. Never read a Bible verse. All of the Bible points to Jesus. Well done. Give yourselves a clap. That was impressive. All right. So, everything in the Bible revolves around Jesus. He is the promised one. There we go. Sent by God to redeem God's people and rescue them from the fallout of evil and sin. That word fallout is used deliberately. Think about nuclear bombs and fallout infecting everything. That's exactly the thought in mind. Keeping in mind that all the Bible points to Jesus, especially when reading the Old Testament, can help resolve a lot of the things that are difficult to make sense of. Jesus even points this out when he's walking along the road to Emmaus after he's resurrected. And he explains that to the guys he's walking with, that the whole of the Old Testament points to Jesus all the way through. So nowadays, although you can't see it, we are in this area up there which says message. And it's the second last part of the big Bible storyline, where we are in this phase of history where we are to proclaim the message, the whole story to people at the right time. We're waiting for Jesus to return from heaven to bring judgment and the new creation. The New Testament starts, and it's sort of up there, with Jesus as the central character. And from then on, it all points to Jesus as well. Either to his return, or either to what he's done right there, or to his return in the future. And what that means for people and for the world. All of the Bible points to Jesus. I'm not saying that every word or every line literally points to Jesus. Sometimes a line does. You might jump to Isaiah 53:6 when it says that God has laid on him the iniquities of us all. Well, the him that Isaiah in the Old Testament was looking towards is what we now know to be Jesus. But other times when we read something like in the book of Judges, the cycle of sin and judgment and redemption that keeps going through that whole book, we are looking ahead to the one who will break that cycle of sin and judgment and in fact be judged for sin himself, therefore redeeming us. All of the Bible points to Jesus. So let's apply this a little bit if we can. Rob raised some excellent questions which led him to walk away from his faith. Questions related to slavery and questioning the moral integrity of God. I am happy to say that with a deeper look, using some of those ideas that we've touched on today, Rob has turned back to his faith. I'm not going to try and answer his objections here. You can read about them in the book, How Not to Read the Bible. But I am wondering if anyone here loves prawns or lobster. Probably. Apologies to those who have allergies or who don't like those foods, like me, but I think this example might still be helpful. For all those who love shellfish, I wonder if you've ever had just a moment of guilt when tucking in. Not for how much it costs, but this little biblical thing about maybe the Bible prohibits you from eating them. But how can you not, I guess, is the case. Well, if you've never felt guilty, maybe now you will, and I'm sorry for that. Non-Christians love having a go at Christians who eat these foods, suggesting they're either ignorant, they don't know their Bibles, or that they're cherry-picking and only reading the parts they want to and ignoring the rest. What verse are they talking about? We had it read earlier. I'm just going to pick the last line of it from Leviticus. It's chapter 11, verse 12. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean by you. This seems pretty clear if you read the rest of it. Fish, okay. Shellfish, not okay. So this would be a good time when you come across this verse to sing the song. I won't get you to do it again. If we remember that the Bible is a library, not a book, which section is Leviticus in? The Old Testament. So it's very ancient to start with. It's a law book filled with laws that were written at a specific time to a specific people for a specific purpose. If we remember the Bible was written for us, but not to us, well, it was written to ancient Israel. And it was part of the law that God had given to Moses to teach ancient Israel about how they were to relate to God and remain distinct from the other nations around them. Just as God is holy and set apart from everything, Israel was also to be holy and set apart from the other nations. And this was one of the ways they were to do so. If we know we should never read a Bible verse in isolation, we do some due diligence and we read the paragraph the verse is in. When we do that, we see it's God telling Israel about what he calls clean and unclean sea creatures that they might choose or be tempted to eat. The chapter the paragraph is in tells us more broadly about other foods that God will consider for Israel, clean and unclean, including some livestock, birds, lizards, insects, and so on. And at least we should find out more about the book this chapter and verse is in. Hopefully, reading the whole book at some stage. When we do, we discover that the whole book is filled with information about how this ancient people should live practically in order to remain right before God. And it particularly focuses on how their sin should be dealt with through this complicated sacrificial system. Finally, remembering that all of the Bible points to Jesus, we see that Leviticus is highlighting God's holiness and our unholiness. We see all these laws and regulations that ancient Israel was supposed to keep, and we see that this is all designed to help them approach a holy God and to ultimately have their sin forgiven, particularly through this system of sacrificing innocent livestock for a guilty people. Looking ahead to the New Testament, we see the way that this system pointed to Jesus. He becomes the final sacrifice and the perfect sacrifice that does away with all of the Old Testament laws and the covenant and ushers in the new covenant. People can now approach God through Jesus, who dies in their place and enables their sin to be forgiven. His righteousness then becomes theirs. So, in conclusion, there are a lot of hard to understand things in the Bible. Remembering the 4 tips, maybe you'll sing them in those moments where you're trying to just think of something else and it just keeps coming back. Maybe remembering them will help you deal with these issues a little bit more easily. And I'm not saying everything's going to be instantly clear as a result. And it's definitely worth discussing these difficult verses with other people. And I definitely recommend, if you want to look into this more, read the book How Not to Read the Bible. It's a great place to start. I feel like we're not going to sing it one more time. You can watch the video, the recording for that. But maybe we will pray, and then I'll hand back to our team. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you that you have revealed yourself generally to all people, and specifically through the Bible to all people. We acknowledge that some of what the Bible contains is hard for us to understand. Thank you for people who love you and love your word and want all of us to have the skills to read it well so that we might know Jesus and what he has done for us. Please, when we get to these hard parts that we find disagreeable or difficult or offensive or unclear, help us to put into practice good Bible reading skills so that we might know your original intentions and how we should apply the Bible to our lives today. Amen.